Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this press conference on the IMF's Regional Economic Outlook for the Western Hemisphere. I am Maria Candia with the Communications Department, and I'm pleased to introduce to you this morning Ilan Goldfajn, the IMF's Director of the Western Hemisphere Department. Ilan will give his remarks, and after that, we will take your questions. Ilan, good morning.
Good morning. The war in Ukraine is shaking the global economy and raising uncertainty about the outlook for the Western Hemisphere. The region is hit by one inflationary shock on top of another. The poor will be hit the hardest. Higher inflation is affecting real incomes in Latin America, especially among the most vulnerable. Policymakers are reacting to this challenge by tightening monetary policy and implementing measures to soften the blow on the most vulnerable and contain the risks of social unrest. A recent country-focused commentary elaborates more on inflation. Large central banks in the region have acted promptly and decisively to tackle rising inflationary pressures by raising interest rates ahead of central banks in many other emerging markets and advanced economies. These actions, together with their hard-won credibility, have allowed them to keep long-term inflation expectations anchored. This is important for stability and predictability. Central banks will still need to remain vigilant and continue taking decisive actions if needed to keep long-term inflation expectations in check. Latin America's growth rebound from the pandemic was strong, but was poised to slow even before the war in Ukraine. After a sharp rebound in 2021, growth is returning to its pre-pandemic trend rate as policy shift, slowing to 2.5% for 2022. Exports and investments are resuming their role as main growth drivers, but central banks have had to tighten monetary policy to combat and increase inflation. We forecast Brazil's expansion will slow to 0.8% this year, following last year's growth of 4.6%. Mexico will decelerate to 2%. Growth in Chile and Peru is expected at 1.5% and 3% respectively. Colombia, conversely, is expected to grow at a higher 5.8%. The war in Ukraine will have a differential impact on growth in commodity importers and exporters. For net commodity exporters, higher prices can be an opportunity to boost economic activity as the export revenue go up. For others, the negative effect of higher import prices could dominate. To protect the most vulnerable, government should use targeted and temporary support while allowing domestic prices to adjust to the extent possible. This will help vulnerable groups and contain fiscal costs while incentivizing production and restraining consumption. Several countries in the region have acted in the wake of Ukraine invasion to contain the effects of rising prices on vulnerable groups, ranging from tax and import tax tariff reduction to price cap or social transfers. Close to 40% of countries in the region have introduced new measures, mostly on the tax side, with an estimated average fiscal cost equal to 0.3% of GDP for this year. Inclusive consolidation is needed. With public debt to GDP ratios above pandemic levels and borrowing costs rising, countries will need to ensure the sustainability of public finance to help preserve credibility and rebuild fiscal space. However, it will be equally important to implement measures that protect the most vulnerable. This will require a strategy that focuses on inclusive consolidation. What does that mean? Spending in social programs, health, education, and public investment should be protected, while implementing tax reform such as strengthening personal income taxes to include those who can afford to pay. This will bolster growth in an inclusive manner and help countries maintain fiscal sustainability. Downside risks prevail. Financial conditions in Latin America have remained benign so far. However, a possible escalation of the Ukraine war could eventually lead to global financial distress and tighter financial conditions for the region. In addition, the ongoing tightening of monetary policy in the United States, as the Federal Reserve takes a more hawkish stance, could eventually affect global financial conditions. Higher global and domestic financing costs can accelerate capital outflows and represent a challenge to the region, given large public and external financing needs in some countries and limited resources to finance investment in the region. A greater growth deceleration of China, because of the pandemic or other reasons, could also have an impact on key export prices and trade in the region. All these risks could cloud growth prospects for Latin America and require timely and well-calibrated policy action. But not all is glooming. I want to stress that during a series of very productive meetings with the authorities of the region over the past few weeks, I have been encouraged by the clear recognition of the challenges and the risks lying ahead, as well as a strong commitment to tackle these challenges. We are ready to work with them to promote the best outcomes for Latin America.
Thank you, Ilan. We're going to start with an online question, is regional focused, from Rafael Balago, de Folha Sao Paulo. How the higher prices of commodities could affect Latin America? Could it bring some benefits for the economy's region, or will it bring more problems?
Well, all the countries in Latin America, the region, are affected by inflation. Inflation is a global shock, and even if the shock could be positive for some export commodity countries, they're all facing higher prices. And especially they're facing higher prices of energy and food that affect disproportionately the poorer. So the main channel where the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the main channel to the region is inflation and the impact of energy and food prices on the poor. However, there is quite a bit of heterogeneity. We have importers of commodities, food, and energy, quite a bit of Central America, some Caribbean. They have a negative shock, while the countries, for example, in South America, they export grain, they export metals, some of them export even oil. Those will have a positive shock. In a more strategic way, some of the countries in the region could position themselves as the solution to the global problem of food insecurity and the need to provide more food to the world. So they can position themselves as a solution to the problem, exporting food, increasing the production, having a positive impact.
Thanks, Ilan. We have several questions on Mexico. Let me read you a few of them. Maybe we can group them. So Silvia Rodriguez from Milenio, she's asking about the war in Ukraine, also rising inflation, tighter financial conditions for the region. And you also mentioned in your blog social unrest and growth, that social unrest, could worsen growth prospects in Latin America and the Caribbean. So she's asking in Mexico, which of the variables we should pay more attention to?
This is an important question. Our blog comments that the region has unusually high risks at the moment. Those risks come from two shocks: the pandemic dynamics that led to high inflation, and later the inflationary shock coming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is an inflationary shock on top of another inflationary shock. What are the risks of that? Of course, if this eats into the real income of the population, and especially of the most vulnerable, there is a risk on the social cohesion and social unrest. But those are not the only risks. If the war broadens or it affects financial global conditions, it may generate financial distress. And we know that the region is very well affected by financial conditions, global financial conditions. And talking about financial conditions, we also have the tightening of monetary policy in advanced economies, especially in the US. And traditionally, when the US tightens, when advanced economies tighten, we get an impact on capital flows, on depreciation of the currencies, and higher borrowing conditions. And the financial conditions locally in the countries also tighten. So there's a risks coming from inflation, risks coming from financial conditions, both from the war and from the tightening of monetary conditions. And last but not least, we have a risk coming from deceleration, for example, from China, where we may have still the pandemics have an impact on growth, or other impact of growth from several causes.
Thanks, Ilan. Let me just recognize a few questions on Mexico from other reporters. So Sylvia was also asking, what can the federal government do to protect the most disadvantaged and promote economic growth? Yolanda Morales from El Economista is asking about inflation and the risk of stagflation in Mexico. Leonor Flores from El Universal is asking about Mexico's growth potential. What is needed for Mexico to take advantage of this growth potential? And finally, Leticia Hernandez from El Financiero, she's asking about the government's policy of subsidizing energy prices. If you think you consider this measure appropriate, and would that be an effective way to do this without causing further fiscal damage?
So I think there are two sets of questions that are coming. One is about the growth prospect and what is happening. And the other one is about the impact of the energy and the food and what countries are doing and what they can do to protect the most vulnerable or to protect in general the population. In terms of the growth prospects, the region rebounded quite strongly. I think the vaccination programs, the policies in general, and also global economy grew very strong last year. That meant that the rebound in the region was strong. Last year, growth in Latin America and the Caribbean was 6.8%, which is a strong growth for the region. We don't expect this rebound to continue this year. You have a rebound from 2020, and now we are heading towards a more traditional growth in Latin America that tends to be lower. So going into the more traditional growth is 2.5%. That's what we are forecasting for Latin America and the Caribbean. And also, the declining growth has other reasons. For example, trade partners, the main trade partners of the region are also decelerating. And last but not least, we have seen the inflationary shock either reducing real incomes in the region, but most importantly, it has meant that central banks in the region had to act. They had to increase interest rates. They have to rein on inflation expectations. And over the next year, 2 years, it will have an impact on global demand coming from monetary policy. So the deceleration is a deceleration coming from the rebound and also some factors globally and domestic. Now on the energy. Inflation is a problem by itself. It risks instability. The region has a memory of high inflation, has indexation and inertia mechanisms coming from its past. So anytime you have an inflation is a risk, as I mentioned, and especially when the inflationary shock happens over another inflationary shock, over an already high inflation. And that is something that generates risks, reduces income in general, and has to be dealt with. However, even most important is that the inflation of the poor is around 3 to 4% higher than inflation of the rich. The most vulnerable part of the population of the region has consumption, higher consumption of food and energy for transportation. So countries are now dealing with that. And I must say, we did a survey and more than 40% of the countries have reacted in some measures, either reduce taxes or reduce import duties or subsidize. And the way to react to that, the main recommendation, if there is social safety nets that are built, you should protect the poor, focus on the most vulnerable, and allow prices to react to international prices. And even if you have a safety net which is well developed, you can increase the coverage. However, some of the countries in the region do not have a well-developed safety net. In those cases, there may be scope for temporary measures to smooth the increase in prices temporarily. This has fiscal consequences. So the main recommendation here is, even if you're going to smooth, the key word is temporarily, because there are fiscal costs. In the same way the region acted temporarily to deal with the COVID, they should act temporarily to deal with the energy and food price increases.
Thanks, Ilan. Let me just turn to WebEx. I see colleagues there. Just a reminder, if we could see your faces, turn your cameras, and also raise your hands. That's the way we know that you're interested in asking a question. We're seeing a lot of colleagues from Argentina. Let me go to Eric Martin first from Bloomberg, and then we'll follow up with them. Hi, Eric.
Good morning. Good morning, Ilan. Good morning, Maria Elena.
Good morning.
I'm going to surprise you, I think, speaking before my Argentine colleagues by asking about Argentina. Wanted to know, with the program review that is upcoming, and the Economy Minister Martin Guzman's visit to Washington last week, what adjustments need to be made in the Argentina program that was recently approved. Obviously, it was approved in an environment of of many factors that were still on the move or were still developing, and so whether there are adjustments that you can say at this point that will need to be made to accommodate the evolving situation in Ukraine and with Russia. Thank you.
Ilan, if you let me, I'll collect two more questions, because we have a lot of colleagues that are interested in Argentina, so maybe we can give them a chance. Rafael, Liliana, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Maria. Good morning, Ilan.
Good morning.
I also have a question regarding the Argentine program. The Argentine authorities claim they have met the fiscal targets for the first quarter with some extra room. But one of the reasons they accomplished this is that the government took a huge increase in revenue in March from the difference in valuation of inflation-adjusted bonds. Some economists have pointed out that this goes outside the bounds of the agreement and against IMF rules. My question is the staff okay with this maneuver, and will you allow this going forward? Thanks.
And let's give room for just one more question, and then we'll come back. Liliana, please. Liliana from Ámbito. I think you need to unmute yourself, Liliana. We're not hearing you.
Now?
There you go.
Hello?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good morning. Sorry. I wanted to know when the IMF staff mission is coming to Argentina. And the second question is related that Argentina has a very safe net for the vulnerable people. And in the blog, you should suggest that the prices should lead to the market, which is not happening in Argentina. And related, I mean, with the commodity prices and energy prices. What is your consideration with that? Thank you.
Thanks, Liliana. Ilan.
So thank you. Good morning for those that asked the questions here in the WebEx. In Argentina, the name of the game now is implementation. The program was approved, and now we need to see implementation. And having the program implemented, I'm sure we're going to start addressing Argentina's needs and needs of the people. As you know, reviews are normal. They happen for all the programs, and this is also the case in Argentina. We are now looking into prioritizing and looking what are the measures to prioritize in order to ensure that the programs and targets of the program are met. And they are not going to change. We are just going to give support to the Argentine authorities to prioritize in order to fulfill the targets and the objectives of the programs. There has been conversations, negotiations with the authorities here in Washington. These continue, and we expect to finalize the review in May. As in many other countries, Argentina has been affected by the global shock in inflation. As you know from what I just mentioned, in all the region is facing higher inflation, and this is also the case in Argentina. And reviews usually they take into account whatever the new reality is, as it is in all the countries. In terms of the safety net and the energy, the recommendation is similar to any other of the countries we have just mentioned. You should prioritize, target the poor, be able to protect the most vulnerable, and be sure to respect your fiscal conditions. And as I mentioned, the name of the game is temporary.
Thanks, Ilan. We have one question, I think, from Paula Lugones from Clarín.
Yeah, also, I'd like to repeat my questions about the fiscal targets, if possible, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Rafael. Let me go to Paula, and I'm not sure if also Patricia wants to come in. Paula, do you wanna ask a question, or? I don't think we can hear you.
I think you're muted.
Yeah. Let me just go to Patricia in the meantime. Patricia Valli from El Cronista.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
I was also wondering what Rafael asked, whether the way the bonds are registered in the balance sheet is something that the IMF allows. And also, if you could explain a little bit why with the rise of international prices, why the inflation target hasn't been changed or will not be changed?
I mentioned that under the reviews, we analyze everything that has changed globally. You made a question on affirmation, which I did not make about not changing. This is, of course, under consideration, under the review. This is normal. Under any of the review, you have several countries that being under reviews and analyzed, either for the surveillance or programs, and they all taking into account the new reality of the Ukraine war. Regarding the question on the fiscal targets, as I mentioned, the objective now is implementation, is to prioritize and find the measures to be able to ensure that the targets are met and the objectives of the program are continue. And we are looking at all the measures and in the middle of the conversation, so I'm not gonna give you anything that has not yet been reviewed. We're gonna have this review fortunately by May.
Thanks, Ilan. Let me just move to Brazil, and then we can come back to WebEx if there's an additional question. So Marcelo Osakabe from Valor Económico is asking, regarding Brazil, what made IMF raise its 2022 GDP forecast from 0.3 to 0.8% and to cut forecasts for 2023? Also regarding Brazil, which is one of the countries that are being benefited by better terms of trade, what are the main risks ahead?
So we have seen in the region, not only in Brazil, a very strong rebound last year. And we have seen in several countries the beginning of the year signals of continuation of this growth. This is valid in several countries, Brazil, Argentina, and several other countries. Growth last year has been strong in the beginning of the year. And that's the reason why we have increased the forecast from 0.3 to 0.8% in Brazil. Now, as I mentioned, there is deceleration of trade partners, and especially countries are facing the inflationary global shock, and monetary policy has been tightened, and that means that we will see some impact on demand going forward, and this means that we have an impact on at the end of this year, but next year too.
Thanks, Ilan. So we're moving to Chile. So Amanda Mars from El País is asking, what are the projections for this next year, and what are the biggest risks for this year's as well? And Linia Castañeda from El Mercurio, she sent an online question asking about the new GDP growth projections for Chile. Has the IMF considered the effects of the constituent process? Is there a concern related to the Constitutional Convention in Chile?
So Chile has had an economic recovery that is well underway. It was 11.7% in 2021. It was supported by policy response, vaccination, and now we are seeing this policy being removed. Those were extraordinary stimulus policies. We believe this is appropriate and will mitigate risks that I mentioned, but also inflationary risks that we have been talking here. So with this tightening of policies, we expect growth to slow to 1.5%. So risks are elevated because of what I mentioned globally, not in Chile, which are risk of financial tightening in advanced economies, risks of the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine having an impact on global financial conditions, China deceleration. All of these are risks that Chile also has from the global conditions. But we do have in Chile a track record of strong policies and institutional frameworks, low public debt. So all of them enhance Chile's resilience and capacity to respond to shocks.
Thanks. I think that question was actually from Amanda from Diario Financiero. She's also on WebEx, and we can call on her, but she's not raising her hand. So Amanda, let us know if you'd like to come in, and we're here in case you have an additional question. Let me turn to Ecuador, Ilan. Another online question from Sebastián Angulo in Expresso. He's asking, why has the fourth review of the program that Ecuador maintains with the IMF been delayed? And he also is asking, the government has mentioned that it will ask for more fiscal space for public investment and boost growth. Is the IMF considering it?
So Ecuador, it was supposed, normally it will have happened, the fourth review in December last year. There were some decisions that required some more plans around the end of the year. We needed to see additional data. But then at the beginning of the year, there were these shocks that we mentioned, the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That, of course, meant, as you asked the question, in several countries, that also meant that we needed to look at the new numbers, the review. So as you see, in Ecuador, in other countries, they're all looking at the global shock and the reviews. So the staff and the authorities are working very closely together on an ongoing basis in the last week. And before that, a team visited Quito in mid-March. Last week, the authorities were here in the spring meetings. So the engagement continues. A lot of very good progress has been made, and we expect to finalize the discussion soon. Regarding whether there's space for public investment and boost growth, we believe that Ecuador has a positive shock coming from the oil increase, and the authorities are committed to fiscal sustainability, which means that you have space for both growth-enhancing investment and building buffers so that you have fiscal sustainability over the long term. So we are confident that we are going to finalize soon. And we are also confident there is enough space for both investment and building buffers for fiscal sustainability.
Thanks, Ilan. Let me read just one more question online from Panama. Roberto González Jiménez is asking if you can confirm, the trend, if you can talk about the factors that explain the upward revision for Panama. And what are the elements that will generate economic growth in 2022?
So there is a pattern here in the region. Very strong rebound that went to the end of the year and at the beginning of this year. So that's the question on Brazil. That has happened in Argentina. We just talked about Chile. And again on Panama. Why would there is an increase in the forecast for Panama? Basically, we had a very strong third quarter and fourth quarter, so that carries over for the average increase in 2022. In addition for that, there is a construction of new metro line, recovery of private investment, an increase in commodity, as we mentioned. Export of commodities is where the region can position itself as the solution of what the world needs. So here we have the export of copper, but we have export of grains in part of the region, export of metals, and even export of oil. And this positioning of a region that can provide what the world needs is a positioning that could help boost credibility in the region. So Panama, strong growth, end of the year, beginning of this year, growth at 7.5%, more demand in the sense of more investments, public and private, and export of commodities.
Thanks. Thanks, Ilan. We're going to go to WebEx before we take one final question online. Eric, you have your hand. Can you? Yeah, Reason. Can you?
Yeah, thank you. No, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of the questions with Argentina about targets, because Ilan, I just want to make sure, for clarity that I'm understanding right, that my colleagues are understanding correctly. I heard you say that the targets will not change, but then Liliana asked about the target for inflation, and you said you hadn't said it would not change. Are we using targets in? I'm wondering if we're each, using targets in a different definition, or if you could just explain a little bit what you mean by targets not changing, or if you're focusing on the fiscal target or which target you're describing.
Yes, so thank you very much for your question. There are assumptions in the program and targets, and inflation is one of the assumptions on the framework. And the targets are fiscal targets, monetary financing, structural targets. So those are the targets that I mean. Of course, the assumptions could change because of the new new macro framework that comes from from the global economy, new shocks. As I mentioned, in the case of Ecuador, they need to be changed. Those are assumptions that build into the framework. Well, the targets are fiscal and reserves and structural. And those will not change because we have program objectives, and what we need to do is help the authorities prioritize the measures in order to fulfill these targets.
Thanks, Ilan. And let me just finalize with a question from the Caribbean, from Peter Richards, Caribbean Media Corporation. He's asking, given the sharp escalation in price of staple food items and fuel, should Caribbean countries be looking to cut subsidies at this time?
There is, as I mentioned, a very important impact of food and energy in most countries. And in the Caribbean, in addition to the impact on the most vulnerable, there's also impact on balance of payment on the countries that have import. It is important at this point is to be able to protect the most vulnerable part of the population, use the existing safety nets if they exist, increase the coverage of them, and as possible, try to implement prices to be as close as possible to international prices, having in mind that there are fiscal costs. We calculated that the fiscal costs of the region of those measures that have been done are around 0.3% of GDP up to now. So we need to be careful on the vulnerable, use the safety nets, increase them if possible, but have in mind the fiscal cost. In places where you don't have well-established safety nets, you could try to smooth the shock over time by not increasing by immediately, by smooth it over time. That also has costs, but here the name of the game is temporary so that you can protect the population, but at the same time have fiscal sustainability over the long term.
Thank you, Ilan. With this question, we end this press briefing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and stay safe. Have a good day.